We've been discussing the Brisker Rav, who sees in Daled Kosos two different dimensions. One dimension is Sidur Broch al Hakos, and the other is Shtiyas Hakos. The Ramah quotes a Maharil that seems to throw a monkey wrench into this whole twofold structure, two-dimensional structure of Daled Kosos. So this you'll see in the Otzer Hayunim on page Hey, on the bottom of the right column. Misha ein lo yayin l'daled kosos yochol levarich al chamar medina. Now, chamar medina is acceptable for a koshel bracha, but in daled kosos, according to Brisker Rav at least, we have an additional dimension to the mitzvah, and that is shtiyas kos derech cherus. In fact, in the case of Yayin Chai, we said Yidei cherus lo yotza. He did not fulfill his mitzvah of demonstrating cherus because he drank undiluted, concentrated wine. The Maharil is offering an option of Chamer de Medina. And again, from the dimension and the perspective of Koshel Bracha, the Maharil's psak is absolutely acceptable and understandable. But what about the shti of yayin? That requires yayin. Certainly Chamar Medina is not yayin. He says, Mikol makom, this is the Brisker Rav, din shtia derech cherus ein yotzid b'chamar Medina. You need a mashke shel cherus. A mashke shel cherus with shtia derech cherus requires yayin, and certainly would not be fulfilled through chamar medina. And therefore, what we'd have to say, according to the Maharil, who's one of the great Ashkenazic poskim, he's one of the Amudei HaHorah for Ashkenazic psak, that he holds that Daled Kosos should be reduced to one dimension, and that is Koshel Bracha. Hence, Chamar Medina is just as acceptable as Yayin, completely excluding a second dimension to Daled Kosos of Shtia Derech Cherus. Perhaps one could say, according to the Maharil, that Yayin Mazug is some sort of a Hidur mitzvah, because it enhances his enjoyment of the yayin, but that's not really the ikar mitzvah daled kosos, which can be reduced to one dimension, namely koshel bracha, that can be fulfilled with chamar medina. The Brisker Rav says, you know what? You can't really prove anything from the Ramah's quote on the Maharil, because the Ramah clearly introduces this with the following stipulation, Misha ein lo yayin, which means that although there are two dimensions to the Daled Kosos, but in effect, he cannot fulfill both dimensions because he has no access to Yayin. With regard to such a situation, the Maharil tells you, but you can still fulfill the mitzvah of Daled Kosos Shel Bracha, even in the absence of Yayin, forfeiting the mitzvah of Shtia Derech Cherus by reciting the four brachos over Yayin, over Chamar Medina. So the Chamar Medina, in a case where he is left with no possibility of Shtias Yayin, because he has no access to Yayin, so he'll use, for example, at the time of the Ramah, it was very common for Chamar Medina to use raisin wine. And with raisin wine, he can fulfill koshel bracha. For example, let's say Havdalah on Motzi Shabbos, regular. You could fulfill that mitzvah of Havdalah on Chamar Medina. And insofar as Daled Kosos are Kosos Shel Bracha, each kos has its own corresponding bracha. You can fulfill that on Chamar Medina. That doesn't mean to say that the Maharil is denying the additional dimension and kiyum of Daled Kosos of Shtia Derech Cherus. that for sure he's required to do if he only has access to wine. Okay. Now on the left column here on page Hey, we're going to talk about the sheet of the Gaon, the Vilna Gaon. And the Brisker Rav vacillates back and forth about the Shitas Hagon. He thinks that the Gaon might actually reduce Dalit Kosos to one dimension, namely Kosos Shel Bracha, which, by the way, would imply that if that's the Shitas Hagon, the Gaon would advocate using Chamar Medina for Dalit Kosos, like in any case of a Kosos Shel Bracha. However, the Brisker Rav has a different take on the Shitas Hagon, that Arba Kosos is definitely and fundamentally different than a Kosos Shel Bracha. But although that's the interpretation of the Brisker Rav, others, maybe contemporaries of the Brisker Rav, disagree, and they think that according to the Gaon, you can reduce Dalit Kosos to Kosos Shel Bracha. There's no additional dimension. So as we go along here on page Hey of the Yotzer Ayunim, we're going to see a development of the Shitas Hagon. But we're going to start with the machlokas between the Ritva and the Rosh, which is quoted in Hilchos Shabbos by the Shulchan Aruch Simon Reish Ayin Aleph. The question is, how much do you have to drink of a Kosos Shel Kiddush? In Hilchos Shabbos Reish Ayin Aleph, the Shulchan Aruch addresses the requirements of Kiddush on Friday night. And the issue here is what we call shtios mitztarfos. When there's a minimum amount of wine that has to be drunk from the Kosos Shel Kiddush, does one person have to, as a singular effort, he has to drink that shear, or can that shear of yayin be divided up amongst the number of people? And that's going to be a machlokas between the Ritva and the Rosh. So let's say, for example, the shear of Kiddush is Mole Lugmav. Can Ruvain drink half of Mole Lugmav and Shimon drink the other half of Mole Lugmav? Now, on the Shulchan Aruch, there's something called the Bir Hagra. And he explains that we have to go back to the Gemara in Pesachim, Kuf Chesam and Beis, in our Pesachim that we've been studying. It says there, Hishka Mehem Lebanav Ulebnei Beis, so Yotza. He could give the members of his household something to drink from the Dalit Kosos, and he fulfills his mitzvah. But he must drink Rov Kos. So the Rosh says, and we've seen this in the past in the Chuvas HaRosh, that what the Gemara has in mind here is that if somebody drinks Mole Lugmav, like Echad B'nei Beso, then he fulfills his chiyuv. The Ritva says that im hishka lebanavu b'nei beso yotza im kulam yachad shasu shir Mole Lugmav, that when Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says v'hu the ishte ruba de kosa, which equals to Mole Lugmav, then it means that from the entire collection, the assembly of the Bnei Beso, from the cost, an amount of Mole Lugmav was drunk. Whereas the Rosh interprets it, that the Gemara means that if Acher Shasa Mole Lugmov, even if he himself doesn't drink the Mole Lugmov, but one of the members of his household drinks Mole Lugmov, then he's Yotze. Not like the Ritva, who says that Kulam Yachad, the sum total and volume of that which was drunk by many, many different members, each one drinking a fraction of Mole Lugmov, was Mole Lugmov. The Rush interprets it that somebody at the table has to drink Mole Lugmov, one person, alone. And this is the interpretation of the Gaon, of the Machlokes between the Ritva and the Rush. Once again, the Rush requires that someone drink Rov Kos, Mole Lugmov, one person. And the Ritva says, no, we can be mitzaref many people shtia in order to get to the point of Mole Lugmov. Says the Gris, the Brisker Rav, that a koshel bracha requires shtia. But that's only as a din of koshel bracha, meaning you recited the bracha on the kos. The kos now takes on a special status, a high level halachic status of koshel bracha. And now, in order to honor the kos, you drink from the kos. And that definition is now by the Gaon being applied to the Gemara in Kuf Ches in Masechet Pesachim that's referring to Daled Kosos. So obviously the Gaon understood that the law of Daled Kosos is equal to the law of Koshel Bracha. And the Machlokas as to whether or not Shtios Mitztarpos, or you need Shtia on the part of one individual of a full Rov Kos Mole Lugmov, in its original source is a machlokas regarding Daled Kosos. Obviously, therefore, the Gaon understood that Daled Kosos is really just simply Koshel Bracha. And he writes the following: Midivri Agra hochiach agrid shu sover she so din arba kosos eno shtias hakosos ela kechol koshel bracha sheish lishtos hakos rak machmas kovid habracha. So if the whole din of shtia in Daled Kosos, like any koshel bracha, is because of kovid hakos, then we understand that, let's say, according to the Ritva, for example, you could be mitzaref many different shtios, because the kos, as a hefta, the kos was drunk. Shagra kosav she'in vira gmor kaga sharba kos chayav adam lishtos mole lugma v'lo moel litzaref es b'nei beiso af bekidush adinke. According to the Rush, if Daled Kosos requires that one person alone drink Mole Lugmov without being mitzaref to others, then the Rush is equating that with Kiddush. So what happened to Shtiyas HaKos? If the Rush is deriving halachas and Kiddush from Arba Kosos, that doesn't make any sense, because in the case of Arba Kosos, there's a separate din of Shtiyah. But maybe in Kiddush, as an example, as a paradigmic example of a koshel bracha, perhaps the Rush would also agree, or should agree, that Shtios mitztarpos, and the Rush rejects it. He says that no, Kiddush requires that one person drink Mole Lugma, and he derives that from Daled Kosos. That would make sense only if Daled Kosos can be reduced to Kosos Shel Bracha. Because if you're going to add another dimension to the requirement and the mitzvah of Daled Kosos, namely that you need Shtiyas HaKos, that doesn't prove anything about Kiddush. Maybe in Kiddush we could be mitzaref many shtiyos together. But the answer is that kos of Daled Kosos is exactly equal to a kosher bracha, and therefore we have a right, the Rosh has a right, and it's justified by the right to derive conclusions about kosher bracha, like Kiddush, from Daled Kosos. But now we have to ask the following question. Does the Vilna Gaon himself agree that Daled Kosos can be reduced to Kosos Shel Bracha, and that's it? There's no other dimension. Or perhaps, says the Brisker Rav, the Rosh is operating within the framework of Shitas HaTosfos. And as you recall, we mentioned it many, many times. Tosfos at the beginning of our Pesachim says that you don't have to supply every member of the household with Daled Kosos. There's Medayik from the Mishnah low. And the Baal Bayis has in front of him Daled Kosos, and that's enough. No one else drinks from the kos, which is exactly identical to a kos shel bracha. One person recites, for example, Kiddush or Abdul ala kos, and that's about it. No one else has to drink from the kos. So within the framework of Shitas HaTosfos, the Rosh says that the Moli Lugmov has to be a one-man show. And we cannot accept Shtiyos Mitztarfos. And that was what Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak meant when he qualified and he said, Vahu sheshasa rov kos. He himself has to drink rov kos. There's no, vicarious siruf of Reuven, Shimon, Levi, each one drank a third. No. There's no such thing. But that's the Shitas HaTosfos. We don't accept that shita. We require that every individual member of the Daled of the Leila Seder is equipped with his own Daled Kosos. And the reason for that is because Daled Kosos, in addition to being Kosos Shel Bracha, has the dimension of Shtia. And every person has to fulfill in his own personal body Shtia. And he writes, "Ochiach agri shegam agra bir shechol yisod din daled kosos din kos shel kiddush." Now, the Brisker Rav wants to say that I'll prove to you that according to the Gaon, there's much more to Daled Kosos than just Kosos Shel Bracha. And now he quotes the next Simon in Shulchan Aruch, that's Reish Ayin Beis, where he writes, Yayin Chai, Afilu Muchazak, Dad Chad Chlosa Maya. Right, in other words, it's got less than a ratio of 3-to-1 of Mayim. Mekadshim Olah. You can recite Kiddush as the Shulchan Aruch on Yayin Chai. But the Gemara says in Pesachim Kuf Ches Amud Beis that with regard to Daled Kosos, Yayin Chai is not acceptable. Yidei Cheres Lo Yotza. So why is it Lagabi Kiddush, the Shulchan Aruch passes Chatchila, you could use Yayin Chai. There's no compunctions, no inhibitions whatsoever. Go ahead and use Yayin Chai. Whereas the Gemara says in Pesachim that Yidei Cheres Lo Yotza, that Yayin Chai is not something. You need Yayin Mozeh. So the Gaon asks this question, and he says, "Sorach Lomar Hod Pesachim Mishum Cheres." Meaning that in Daled Kosos there's an additional element above beyond Kos Shel Bracha. As far as Kos Shel Bracha is concerned, there's no difference in yain chai and yain mazuk. But in Dalit Kosos of Lela Pesach, there we require dafkei mazuk because of cheres. So you see that the Gaon himself insists that in Dalit Kosos is an additional element in the mitzvah of Dalit Kosos of cheres. You don't reduce Dalit Kosos to kosher bracha, and that's it. Is mevuar shechilek hagra bein shtias kosher kiddush. In other words, with regard to kosher kiddush, which is a kos shel bracha, af lechatchila yayin chai kosher, whereas yayin chai for kosher daled kosos is only b'di'evet because yidei cheres lo yatsa, the Gemara says. So it means that Arba Kosos has two different dimensions to it. Number one, it's a kosher bracha, and from that perspective, chai is equal to mazur. And number two, there's a kiyum of cheres that's unique to Dalit Kosos that doesn't apply to every kosher bracha. And here's where we need yayin mazur. Din cheres who din shtias hayayin sheskadish barba kosos. So the din of yayin, that it's got to be yayin, and not only that, it's got to be yayin mazud. All that is a reflection and a manifestation of the unique dimension of Dalit Kosos that adds an element of cheres as a requirement above and beyond kosher bracha. So Lamaisa, at the end of the day, if you ask the Brisker Rav, what is the Shitas Agra? The answer is that the Gra in one place is only defining the Shita the Rosh. And the Shita the Rosh is predicated on an exact analogy, an equation between Dalit Kosos and Kosher Bracha. And the Rosh is going to derive that just like in Dalit Kosos, you need one individual, I called it a one-man show, to drink Moli Lugmav, so too in Kiddush and all Dalit Kosos, and all Kosher Bracha. That's because the Gaon is interpreting the Shitas HaRosh, which is an extension and embellishment of the Shitas HaTosvos, that there is no requirement of Shtia and Dalit Kosos. And we don't have to supply every member of the household with Dalit Kosos. But the Gaon himself elsewhere in a different place, with regard to Yain Chai, sets up a contrast between Kosher Bracha, which L'chatchila could be fulfilled with Yain Chai, as opposed to Dalit Kosos, which require not only Yain, but Yain Mazu, because of Derech Chayru. So the Gaon Lemaisa, after all the interpretations, but as far as the view and the ruling of the Gaon, he would require Shtia with regard to Dalit Kosos, not only of Yain, but Yain Mazud, in order to fulfill Derech Cheres, because Dalit Kosos has a unique dimension of Cheres, unique in the constellation of all Kosos Shalom. But now we get to a third paragraph in the Gaon that's going to shed a new light on the Gaon Shita. So far, we have two comments of the Gaon. One with regard to the Rosh against the Ritva, where the Shtios Mitztarfos in Dalit Kosos and in Kosher Bracha. The other comment was the comment of the Gaon with regard to Yayin Mazug as a separate requirement in Dalit Kosos. Now we have a third comment of the Gaon. Gam noshim chayovos bi arba kosos uvechol mitzvos hanogos bi osal lail. The Shulchan Aruch paskins that women are obligated in Daled Kosos and in all the mitzvahs halayla. On that, the Gaon writes, what's the source for this Shulchan Aruch? And he adds 4 words. Me oso atam shel Kosos. Now, let's understand. The Gemara says explicitly that women are obligated in Daled Kosos mishum sha'af hein hoy ba'oso anes. So far, so good. Now the question is, what about the mitzvah of Haggadah, of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim? So the Gaon says that the Shulchan Aruch has an analytic dissection of this question by comparing Daled Kosos to Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. And the Gaon sheds a light on the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch that women are obligated in Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Says the Gaon, what's the source? What's the basis for that? Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, we got it for Bincha Bayomahu is a mitzvah seishes man groma. How do we know women are obligated? Says the Gaon, just like women are obligated in Daled Kosos, and the Gemara is outspoken about that because Afein Hoyiboso and Nes, who are din, who are tam, so too women are obligated in Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim because of Afein Hoyiboso and Nes. That's what it says in the Gaon. Now, obviously, the Gaon understands that within the framework of Daled Kosos, there is a mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Otherwise, how did the Gaon justify the psak of the Mechaber that women are obligated in Sipur by the fact that they're obligated in Daled Kosos? If Daled Kosos is a mitzvah that is independent of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, it's completely, let's cut the umbilical cord, sever the connection between Daled Kosos and Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Okay, women are obligated in Daled Kosos. That doesn't mean or prove that women are obligated in Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim unless we assume that Daled Kosos has an element of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim built into the very essence of that mitzvah. So here he quotes a sefer that's unknown to me. You'll see it in footnote number Lamed Hey, calls the Kovitz Moadim. I don't know what that is. Shedas hagrohi shekol chiyuv arba kosos hurak kosol brocha. V'im nispar shenoshim chayovas bi'arba kos mishum shegam heim hoyu bi'oso anes and kenischari shehem chayovas ba'miras ha'god al kos. Honestly, I don't see the proof here. The Gaon is operating within the framework of a Kiyum Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim through the drinking of Daled Kosos. But I don't know if that means that you can reduce Daled Kosos to Kosos Shel Bracha. Now, his argument here is that each one of the brachos is part and parcel of the fabric of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. Chazal established that the way we fulfill Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim is through these 4 brachos. And now, when we recite these 4 brachos on 4 kosos, and now each one of the 4 kosos is upgraded to the status of a kosher bracha, we now have Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim through the Daled Kosos. And if women are obligated in Daled Kosos, then ipso facto, they must be obligated in CPTs Mitzrayim, because the essence of Dalit Kosos is CPTs Mitzrayim. But that doesn't prove that Dalit Kosos can be reduced simply to Kosos Shel Bracha. It's definitely so that the Kosos Shel Bracha accomplish the following goal. They project Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim into the very fabric and the very essence of the mitzvah of Dalit Kosos. But that doesn't mean that Dalit Kosos can be reduced to Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, which means Darba Kosos Shel Bracha. In other words, if I tell you that all A equals B, that doesn't mean that B equals A. You with me on that? I mean, I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist or a mathematician to have a PhD in mathematics to understand that. It's definitely true that, as the Gaon interprets the Shulchan Aruch, the mitzvah of Dalit Kosos is a mitzvah of Sipur, but that doesn't mean anything more than that Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim is a part and parcel of Dalit Kosos. Could be that Dalit Kosos goes beyond just simply the act of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim and relating the story through these four brachos. So what I'm arguing is that the Gaon is not necessarily saying that, you recite the four brachos, which are reflections and expressions of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, and that's it, and you fulfill the mitzvah. No. The Gaon might say that it's true that Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim is essential to Dalit Kosos, and therefore you need the four brachos. But Dalit Kosos, in addition, requires a shtia derech cherus to make it into a Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim in the fullest sense. In other words, we're going to find here an overlap. Again, this is Berzon talking, not what we're seeing here in the text. We're going to find an overlap of A plus B in order to equal C. In Dalit Kosos, in order to equal C, which is a full-fledged kiyum of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim, we need A plus B. We need A, the recitation of the four brachos, and that's what we call Sipur B'Peh. And then we need another element, another dimension of Sipur through Shtias Hayayin, derech cherus. That demonstration of cherus through drinking yayin mazu completes the mitzvah of Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim vis-a-vis Dalit Kosos. But I don't believe that this Gaon justifies the conclusion that Dalit Kosos equals Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim equals bracha, and all you need is the bracha, and you can completely cut out the shtia derech cherus on yayin mazik. That I don't believe. I'd rather assume you need A plus B. Now, in the footnote here, number Lamed Vav, he has an analysis here, a discussion about the nature of the chiyuv of women in Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim. Is it Doraisa or is it Rabbanan? If it's all based on Dalit Kosos, that would seem to indicate that it is only the Rabbanan. As far as Doraisa is concerned, it's a Zman Groma and women are exempt. But he quotes the Sefer Achinuch, who writes that mitzvah Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim no heges b'zcharim u'b'nekevos. Mashma that Sipur Yitzias Mitzrayim for women is doraisa. So the Minchas Chinuch raises the objection, and this will turn to page Vav. What about mitzvah seishas man groma? So let's just put the Gaon together with the Minchas Chinuch, and it makes one package deal. The mitzvah, let me start it this way, the chova, the obligation of women in Sipit Mitzrayim, is rooted in Dalit Kosos, which is only D'Rabbanan. That's what becomes absolutely clear from the Vilna Gaon. Add that to the argument to the Sefer Minchas Chinuch, to the effect that women are exempt from Sipit Mitzrayim on a D'Oraisa level because it's Man Grama. They're only Chayovos in Sipit Mitzrayim D'Rabbanan based on Dalit Kosos. So that's how we merge the Gaon and the Minchas Chinuch. Now on page Vav, he has an overview and a summary of what we learned about the Gaon. And he says the following. The Gaon says that we have a requirement of Rov Kos, Mole Lugma, Vindalit Kosos, and we derive from that Kiddush. And Kiddush, likewise, you require Shtias Rov Kos, which is Mole Lugma. And that is the Gaon's interpretation of the Shitas HaRosh, that we need one person to drink the entire Mole Lugma. But from the fact that the Rosh is going to derive from Dalit Kosos conclusions as far as the Koshel Bracha, like Kiddush, is concerned, we see that according to the Gaon, the mitzvah of Dalit Kosos can be reduced to Koshel Shel Bracha. However, elsewhere, the Gaon says that Yain Chai, which is acceptable even lechatchila for Koshel Bracha, is excluded in the case of Dalit Kosos. And the answer is that as Koshel Shel Bracha, Dalit Kosos, the Dieved, you can fulfill in Yain Chai, but lechatchila, in order to achieve the additional dimension of Shtia, which is Cherus, you need Yayin, and for example, Chamer de Medina would not be accepted, and not only that, not all Yayin would be acceptable. You'd need Yayin Arev Olav, which means Yayin Mazu. However, from a different Gaon, regarding the Chiyuv of Noshim in Sipit Mitzrayim, which he derives from Dalit Kosos, the argument was put forward that according to the Gaon, the din of Arba Kosos is Kosos Shel Bracha to fulfill Sipit Mitzrayim. We thought that there was no necessity to derive that conclusion. Now the Brisker Rav goes a step further. And he requires L'chatchila Yayin Mozuk for Dalit Kosos, and Sheson Chai Yotza, but even though he was Yotze, that was the statement of Yehuda Mishmuel, but Rava qualifies, and he says, Yidei Yayin Yotza, Yidei Cheres Lo Yotza. Yesh Lachar B'din Zeh. Ha'imu Din Shal Hidur B'chefta Shal Akos, Klomar Shekos Mozu Yosem Mehuda Mikoshe Mozu, Oh, shedin mezigu din b'maisa gava. Shemaisa shtia shal kos mozug adif al maisa shtia shal kos sheina mozug. I don't understand. He's saying that perhaps meziga is required l'chatchila in order to create a heater on the coast. I don't see it that way, because if that be the case, then it should apply to a koshel bracha as well. We didn't find any distinction between a kos of yain mozug and a kos of yain chai with regard to a koshel bracha. Now Tosus says, in the name of Rabbeinu Tam, all right, this is a Tosus in Brachos. We didn't see this Tosus, but he says that Chai, the Hossam, Hainu Mozig velo Mozig. So the word chai, according to Rabbeinu Tam, means mazuk, but not completely mazuk. But what exactly is going on over here? Kosos in Brachos posits a l'chora stira between the Gemara in Brachos Nun Aleph that kosher bracha tzarich lios dafka chai, and yet in Daled Kosos, Rava says that chai lo yotza, yidei cheres lo yotza. So you need meziga. So Rabbeinu Tam reconciles this apparent stira by saying that chai de hasam hainu mozig velo mozig. What does that mean? I can't reduce it to numbers and ratios, but in general, what Toast is saying over here is that you don't want to dilute your wine to the point to which it tastes like, water with a tom of yayin in it. It's vasadika yayin. So it should be mazug, but low mazug, not completely mazug. Like, just to throw out numbers, I mean, don't. Let's say you put 5 cups of water added to 1 cup of yayin chai. Then that's already completely mazuk. And that should be rejected with regard to a kosher bracha. So Tosis is actually operating with the following premise: that if we accepted the Gemara in brachos regarding a kosher bracha that we require chai, then Tosis assumes that the same halach would apply to Daled Kosos. And yet Rava says Shasan Chai lo yatsa yidei cheres. So he writes here, Mavura shesavra atosus she'im legabi kosher bracha nemer din she'achai v'lo mazud. And at this point, I think we're assuming chai means literally, without any meziga whatsoever, pure concentrated wine. Dinu sha'af arba kosos ein lemozgan. The same requirement lechatchila of chai in kosher bracha should apply to Daled Kosos, because Tosa's sheet, as we saw over and over again, is that Daled Kosos kosher bracha. But then the Gemara says that Shasan Chai, with regard to Daled Kosos, Yidei Cheres Lo Yotz. Oh, so the answer is that when Rava in Daled Kosos rejects Chai, it means pure Chai, that it's not Mosig at all. When the Gemara in Kosel Bracha, in Masechet Brachas Nunalf requires Mozug, it means Chai v'Mozug, but Eino Mozug L'gamri. So Tosfos is operating with an exact and total equation between Kosel Bracha and Daled Kosos. And if in Kosel Bracha you require Chai, then in Daled Kosos you require Chai. The Gemara says in Daled Kosos, Chai is not good enough. And the answer is because it's totally Chai, without any admixture of water whatsoever. It's not diluted at all. And in Kosel Bracha, Chai means that it's already been diluted to some extent, not over diluted. When we did Gemara, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, Modim Chacham Rabbi Eliezer b'Kosel Bracha she'im mevorcham v'ashiyitem b'sochel mayim. My timer, Rav Osher b'idem mitzvah min amuvcha. So it means that when it says about Kosel Bracha that you need Chai, it's got to be she'yitem l'sochel mayim. It can't be pure Chai. So just like in Kosel Bracha, we're going to require some element of meziga as a mitzvah in a muvchar, although with the evidence you could be yotzei Kosel Bracha with yayin pure Chai. So too in Daled Kosos l'chatchila, we're going to require that there should be some element of meziga, but not a full meziga. It's still considered in the terminology of Kosel Bracha to be yayin Chai, but it's not completely muzzled. So all this again fits beautifully into the definition of Shitas HaTosfos, that Daled Kosos are just simply Kosel Bracha. The Rama writes, Perek Zayin Halacha Tes, Arba koselu tzorch limzog oson kidei sheyishtia reva kol lefi hayayin ulefi das hashoseh. And it seems that the Rambam is not speaking about some mitzvah min muvchar, that it's a nice idea, and it's an embellishment to the mitzvah if you add yayin, if you add mayim to the yayin, but rather that's an absolute requirement. Kosos elu tzorech limzog oson. So we were talking before about the fact that maybe meziga is a din in the kos itself, right? It's a mitzvah min amuvchar in the kos. That was the paragraph Vehine, the second paragraph on top. Who din shall hider b'cheftzah shel kos. The Rambam is not defining it as a cheftzah shel a hider in the cheftzah shel kos. The Rambam wants a shtia arev. It's in the Maisa shtia. Right. See, it could be that according to Shitas HaTosfos, that the identical halacha of meziga applies to both Daled Kosos Shalel Pesach and to a classic Kosel Bracha. Maybe that's a din. The meziga is a din in the chefts of the kos, possibly. But the Rambam is surely not like that. So in the paragraph Agriz, he points out that according to Tosfos, there's no separate mitzvah of shtia in Daled Kosos, but there is a hidur mitzvah of mezika, like there is in any kosher bracha, even though it's still again chai. The Rambam, on the other hand, has another dimension to Arba Kosos, and that's a din of shtia. Now, in the last line here on the right column, he refers to the Shitas HaGaonim. Well, let's just see if we can refresh our memories here about the Shitas HaGaonim. Which I believe was back on page Aleph. Let me just see if my memory serves me correctly. The Gaon is quoted here on page Aleph in the paragraph that starts Hatur. And the question is, can you be Makadesh on Leil HaPesach on Pas, meaning on Matzah, in a case where he doesn't have Yain? So normally, with regard to Kiddush the whole year round, if you don't have Yain, you can be Makadesh on Pas. And the Gaon is Makadesh that not so in the case of Kiddush on Leil HaPesach, because Kiddush on Leil HaPesach takes on a din of Daled Kosos, and that requires Yain. So this sheet of the Gaon is the exact opposite, the polar extreme of Shitas HaTosfos. Shitas HaTosfos is to equate Daled Kosos with Kosos Shel Bracha. And the sheet of the Gaon is that, on the contrary, the mitzvah of Kosos Daled Kosos is shtia, and shtia means drinking yayin, not pas. And now even the kiddush, which itself is a classic bracha, gets transformed into the mitzvah of shtia of Daled Kosos of yayin. Then on the top left column, he quotes the Rashbam. And he says machlokas between the Beis Yosef and the Pri Chodesh. Let's see if we can remind ourselves of that machlokas. That I think was back on page Bays. Let's see if I'm right. So it's on the left column on page Bays. And the question is, can you be Mekayim Arba Kosos without Birkas HaMazon? So the Shitas HaBeis Yosef is that you could be Mekayim Daled Kosos without the bracha. Like, for example, let's say he didn't have matzah, so he didn't wash and he doesn't bench. And yet the third kos is a kos of Birkas HaMazon. He's not reciting Birkas HaMazon. And the Beis Yosef says he's Yotzi Yidei Chovas. And the Pri Chadash has a different interpretation of the Rashbam and rejects the Beis Yosef. And the Rashbam says that Shason v'Vasachas means Shalol Seder HaBrachos. So the Pri Chadash therefore argues that according to the Rashbam, we must have the brachos. And if he didn't wash on matzah and recite Birkas Hamazon, then he can't be Yotzei, at least that Kos of the Daled Kosos Shel Leil HaPesach. So that's the machlokus between the Beis Yosef and the Pri Chadash, how to interpret the Shitas of Rashbam. Whereas Beis Yosef says that according to Rashbam, you don't need the brachos. So you can be Yotzei Daled Kos without the brachos, and the Pri Chadash disagree. Next, Hatosvis, V'dasa Toso Chichu Achronim Shein Sovru Shekol Din Arba Kosu Din Kosho Bracha. Fine, that we saw, that we don't have to supply every member of the household with his own Daled Kos. It's a Kosho Bracha. The Rambam, he says in the name of the Or Sameach, you require Sipra al Yayin. Avol yesh achronim shebiaru shu sover sheyeshnam shnei dinim ba'arba kosos, gam din kosher bracha, gam din shtia der cheres, v'amagid mishle kosos she is so din arba kosos in the shvil persimani. So I think when he says Yesh Min Achronim, he's referring to the Brisker row. Shnei Dinim, 2 dimensions of Arba Kosos. Okay, now we get up to a section. We don't have much time, but just to mention the discussion that we're about to enter into, Din Simcha Barba Kosos. And the Rashbam says something which is a revolutionary idea, that when you drink Daled Kosos, then you're Yotzei the mitzvah of Simchas Yontif, as if to say that although in general you could be Mekayim the mitzvah of Simcha by drinking 1 kos of Yayin, but on Leil HaPesach we have another din that you have to drink 4 koses of Yayin in order to achieve Simcha. Well, let's make a note of where we got up to here, and Amir Hashem, we'll pick this up tomorrow. Okay then?